All right, thanks everybody. It's an honor to be your first speaker here at the first ever BSides Buffalo, so I hope I got started before track 2 to officially be the first speaker. Before I get going, I just want to thank everybody in a red shirt today. Without volunteers, things like events like this don't happen. And just furthering on with what our fine opening speaker said, we really needed the tall person mic. So if I wander away from the cone of the microphone, please let me know. So my name's Zack Glick. I'm a principal security engineer with New Relic, and I'm going to talk to you today about getting started with AWS security. And just before we get going, a couple of disclosures, because no talk is complete without some. I did work for Amazon for 8 years in their incident response team, so I was there. I currently work for New Relic as a principal security engineer. As with all tweets and talks, these represent my own opinions, not those of any employer, past or present. So what I really want to talk to you today are these two areas, which are, when you're working with security of AWS, there's kind of two places that you need to consider. There's the control plane and the data plane. And we use these terms in incident response to figure out where we actually need to do some response, where there's potential security issues. And so for folks who aren't necessarily familiar with working in the cloud, the data plane is where you're going to feel the most comfortable. These are virtual machines that are running within your AWS account. Your standard EDR agents will probably be there. You can do memory logging or memory forensics. You can capture disk images. You can do all that fun stuff. The control plane is where things get interesting from an AWS or really any cloud provider's perspective. But this talk is going to focus primarily on AWS. The control plane is all of your API calls to AWS itself. It's the security of the AWS account itself, and it's the security of anything that is a managed service. And so when you're working in AWS, you're going to become intimately familiar with this shared responsibility model. The shared responsibility model is what AWS defines of what is their problem and what is your problem. A quick way you can think about this in your head is that security of the cloud is AWS's responsibility, and security in the cloud is your responsibility. AWS will keep the data center doors locked. They'll make sure that there's fiber, that the fiber cuts when they happen, when they're hunted by their natural predator, the backhoe. Those are fixed. We got some data center people here. They'll make sure that the hypervisor security is there, but above their layer, it's your responsibility. So when I worked at AWS, I joked that in AWS security, our jurisdiction was the dirt under the data center, up through the hypervisor, all the computers and humans and software that make up the cloud. This shared responsibility model, because AWS offers so many services, it can move a bit, right? So if a service is more managed, it might move slightly higher on AWS's responsibility, and only configuration is your problem. If it's lower level and you're running EC2 images, then patching an operating system is still your problem. And so keep this shared responsibility model in mind. It doesn't explicitly mention control plane and data plane, but you can think that those map to the control plane is you interacting with things AWS controls on that orange side, and the data plane is your systems operating in the blue. So I'm going to talk about control planes and data planes, but we're going to have some students here, so I want to make sure I do a quick mention about the financial plane, which is not a G5 private jet. It is the fact that in AWS, a click can cost you money. There is an AWS free tier, and you can do a lot of experimentation with it. There are lots of programs to get educational credits through the AWS Activate program. But clicks in AWS can cost money. Leaving infrastructure around can cost money. And if you create a set of credentials, which we're going to talk about later, if those are compromised and used by a malicious actor, they can generate costs for you that you are on the hook for. AWS is pretty good at forgiving accidental bills. Credentials being committed to GitHub accidentally, someone else is going to be crypto mining with your resources within minutes. Contact AWS. I put a link here. These slides are, I'll tweet them out after this so people have the link. Corey Quinn, who's a community member who runs an excellent podcast, did an episode on bill shock. I really have to reiterate what he said is that if you end up with a $40,000 AWS bill because someone mined some crypto on it, the first thing you need to do is breathe. Get a support case open to AWS. They should be able to help you. But please do not overreact if you get an accidental giant bill. But be aware that when you're running in the cloud, you are being billed for what you run. Before we hop into the details, I want to just cover some quick 3 key foundational points. So the first thing is there are a bunch of different ways that you can interact with a cloud service provider. There's the web console itself, which is where a lot of people are going to get their start. There's the CLI, which is where a lot of command line interfaces, which is where a lot of demos will run you through. And then there's the full SDK, which is when you're ready to go into production. That's where you're going to reach out to. But in order to use either one of those 3 things, you're going to need a set of AWS credentials. People will call these an AKID and a secret. Access key ID is where AKID comes from. Secret is the part you want to keep secret. Think of it as a username and password for 2 machines to talk to each other. Publishing an AKID by itself is fine. Publishing a secret is never fine. You should see the secret once when you create it and put it in a password manager when you're done with it. Those credentials can be applied to a few different entities within AWS. There are IAM users, which are long-term, think like a Windows user or a Linux user. There are roles, which are a role you can federate into through some other identity like OIDC or using Okta. You can create federated roles as well as using the root user, which we're going to talk to in a bit. The catch-all for basically any way that you're going to get some credentials in AWS is called an IAM principal. So if you hear me use that term, that just means a user in AWS, a role in AWS. And the last thing is, by default, any IAM principal has no permissions. You have a default deny. So you have to prove to AWS on every API call that your IAM principal has permissions to do the thing that you want to do, and you do that by attaching a policy. So this is a quick example of a policy. They are JSON documents. They can get and do get much more complicated than this, but there are a few just quick areas that I want to run through. You're going to see that this has a version number and that it looks like it's very long ago in the past, and you're going to think, I want to change this to today's date. Leave it the way it is. At some point, they will change this version number. It will be a glorious day. Today is not that day. So everyone's going to have the same date, and it's fine. The effect is what does this clause of this policy allow you to do? So like I mentioned before, AWS has a default deny. So you need to allow a specific permission. So in this example, it's allowing something. You can also create a policy that denies specific actions. And if folks are familiar with their Venn diagrams, your AWS, your IAM principals permissions is that middle section of the Venn diagram of all the policies attached to them. And AWS is looking for a way to deny you the ability to do something. So if there's any explicit denies on any of the policies attached to your IAM principal, you're going to lose and you're going to be denied. The next thing is the action. There are hundreds of AWS services. They have tens to hundreds of actions themselves. IAM policies can be incredibly fine-grained, which is great because it allows you to explicitly control what folks are allowed to do. For folks who have never tried to roll back and implement the principle of least privilege, it's tricky to pull off, but you can pull it off. There's a great product in AWS called IAM Access Analyzer, which will actually look at the history of what an IAM principal has done and recommend a policy to you, and you can chain these permissions together. The last one is the resource. So similar to other role-based access controls, you can say this principal is allowed to perform this action on this specific resource, whether it's an S3 bucket or even a whole service like can launch any EC2 instance. There's also the ability to apply permission directly to an object. So in this case is an S3 bucket. This is basically saying what IAM principals are allowed to interact with this object. We're not going to talk a lot about resource policies today, but if you're getting into AWS, this IAM security is it's a pretty unique place in the cloud. but there are a lot of jobs, and we're going to talk about jobs at the end of this talk. So with that kind of just quick background on IAM principles and policies, that's going to give us some foundation to roll through to the next bit of this talk. So when you first get an AWS account, you're going to have a username and a password. If you have an Amazon.com shopping account, you technically already have an AWS account today. In that case, you can use it if you're thinking of starting a business or a project and you might ever want to share this account with anyone else. I'd highly recommend that you don't use your existing Amazon account for your AWS. The community refers to this as the underwear problem, which is the startup founder had been using their Amazon.com account to buy underwear for 20 years, and now 10 years into the business they're being sold to another company, and they have to find some way to remove the founder's Amazon.com order history. It's a pretty tricky one. So getting an isolated AWS account is a pretty good idea if you're ever thinking that this might turn into something real and not just a lab environment. The root user, similar to a Linux system, is the most powerful user in the AWS account. It's that initial username and password. There are two things that you should ever use the root username and password for. One is to put a hardware MFA token on that root user, and the second one is to create an IAM user with the administrator access policy, and then click the logout button. If you come into a company and it's your first day and they use AWS and you're in charge of securing it, the first thing you should ask is, do you use the AWS root user for anything? And is there an access key and secret for that root user? And then someone's going to give you an answer. Don't believe them. Go to the IAM console, look at the credential usage report, and see if there is an access key and secret for the root user, and see when the last time it's been used. And if it is being used in any way, that is your first security priority for securing an AWS account. If your root user is gone, you cannot feasibly evict someone from the account. You're going to be in an active battle with them for the rest of time for control of that account. We're going to talk about AWS account blast radius later, but I want to stress that if you ever find yourself using the root user for anything, you're probably doing it wrong. Get that root user, put a hardware MFA on it, put it in your safety deposit box or wherever you keep your passports or whatever's, and create an IAM user, and you can do everything with this administrator policy. So we talked about IAM policies before. AWS has a number of what they call managed policies, which are recommended job function policies that they wrote for you. This is the administrator access policy, and it literally says allow any action on any resource. So you can do anything with this policy that the root user can do, almost, but if you lose the credentials for an IAM user, you can evict that user from the account. Like I mentioned before, AWS checks every single API call that you make. They check the permissions that the IAM principal is giving to see if it has the necessary policy. So if you lose the credentials for an administrative IAM user, you can delete the policy from that user, and even though someone will have valid credentials, they won't work. And so you can actually evict someone with this administrator access policy from your account. If they have the root credentials, you're not evicting them. So before we move on, you did put your root credentials away, right? Everyone's going to nod at me that we're going to put our root credentials away. Back tables? Excellent. So the first things that you're actually going to do once you've put your root credentials away is you're going to want some real contact information on this account. Caveat, Amazon loves sending marketing material. You're going to get a lot of marketing email messages, and you're going to want to think of using a throwaway email. We all either have used those one-time sites, or whoever owns throwaway@gmail.com, I'm so sorry for you. Make sure that there is real contact information on your AWS account. Email address, phone number, which can never change, and billing address. If for whatever reason you ever end up in a dispute over who owns the AWS account, Amazon is going to use that information to try and get a hold of you. And if you control it, it's going to be much easier to get your account back. If you've made it up, or it's your Yahoo account that you don't really remember the password for, but you're like, oh yeah, I think I know what that was, you're going to have a hard time regaining custody of that account. And AWS accounts have a tendency to, well, this is just a test account for now, and then 5 years later, it's the production account for that thing that you didn't think was going to turn into the next ACV auto. So keep some real contact information on there. The second thing you're going to want to do is enable CloudTrail for every region. CloudTrail is your syslog for the control plane of AWS. So the control plane are your API calls for working with AWS, and CloudTrail is how you know who done it and when did they do it. We're going to talk about CloudTrail later. So we want to ask, when you're thinking about security in AWS, especially in a production setting, you're going to want to ask yourself this meta question, which is, how many AWS accounts do I actually need? And the answer is, if you're running, in a real environment, it's most likely more than one. AWS has a great document. It's very long. It's called the Well-Architected Framework. It talks about availability, security, billing controls that you can put in an AWS account. Amazon's recommendation is that you have multiple AWS accounts for multiple either projects or teams or organizations, and we'll show you their example hierarchy later. The reason why we do this is because it limits the potential blast radius. Like I mentioned, that root user has full control over an AWS account. If for whatever reason one is created or the credentials are lost or it's compromised, and you're running your entire production network inside of one AWS account, you're going to have a big outage. Whereas if you are segmenting a specific project into a specific AWS account or a specific team within a specific AWS account, that team is going to have a big outage, but it's unlikely and impossible that the blast radius of a compromised set of credentials can hop across the border of an account. I say it's unlikely because there could be some sort of federated role access, but it's a great way of saying, especially if you have any auditors that you're going to bring in and you're going to want to talk about the security controls you have in place, having multiple accounts creates this nice blast radius that you can build in there. And the links in here are for the well-architected framework. If you see green in here, I'll tweet these out later. So there are 2 AWS products that can help you with having multiple accounts. With security, you get some security benefit, but there is some added complexity. AWS Control Tower is a AWS opinionated version of having multiple accounts. So you can select from templates from the well-architected framework, and you can basically launch the way Amazon thinks you should. If you're a new startup and they're like, hey, we want some AWS security put in, Control Tower is a nice way to go for a completely green field. It's unlikely that you're going to be in a scenario where you are able to map your organization exactly how Amazon thinks. And so Control Tower is using AWS organizations, which is you have full control, which is good, but you have full control, which is bad, account hierarchy service. You will do some Googling. You'll see a product called AWS Landing Zones. This was the first attempt at sort of an opinionated multi-account thing. Don't use it. It's on the glide slope to being deprecated, being not useful. So if you're starting something fresh today, avoid landing zones. You might see it in some Google history for AWS multi-account, but if you see landing zone, you're barking up the wrong tree. So this is from a bit of AWS documentation. This shows a recommended AWS account hierarchy for a multi-account setup. And so the first thing is the organizational root. Historically, this has been called the master account, but it was renamed to the organizational root. Similar to the root user or the root user in AWS or the root user in Linux, this is the last level, the highest permissions. Everything cascades down from this particular account. It's very unlikely that you're going to use this account for anything, but there needs to be a source of truth for something. You're going to create a management account, which is the account that your security team, your AWS account administrators will use to manage the organizational hierarchy, which this is a picture of.
Wait,
yes?
Does that correspond to the AWS root user account level there?
So this is the root account. there is a root user within that account, but each one of these boxes is an AWS account. The question for people who are watching the recording later is, does this correspond to the root user? No, it is the root account in the hierarchy. This is a hierarchy of accounts. And so the management account is how you'll interact with all of the both billing. So if you're in a production environment and you're not using a credit card, you're using invoice billing, you can have your accountants get consolidated billing through there. Your security team can have access to CloudTrail records from the whole organizational hierarchy. This is kind of where you're going to be interacting with that organizational account. For folks who are familiar with Active Directory, you can see this organizational unit survives in the cloud. So you can create an organizational unit, which is a group of AWS accounts. So a common one is production and development. Like all good things, you can group your groups. So there can be nested OUs within the larger organizational unit. And policies, which we're going to talk about in a second, can be applied to either the OU or the member accounts. So the member accounts are those individual pockets of AWS that are out there. So an example would be I have an OU for development, and I have a member account for the intern projects, which we all love a good intern project. Interns out there, you're great, but you tend to leave code around and we have to fix it later. But thank you for making it in the first place. But in this case, I could give an intern that full administrator access policy, star.star. They could break everything. They could fix everything too, but they could break everything. But because it's isolated to this specific member account, they can't break production, which is in the other different member account. And the nice thing about this organizational policy is similar to Active Directory, where group policies can push controls down from the can push controls from the top of the hierarchy down. You can apply those same policy statements that we talked about before. You can apply those at the organizational root, and they will cascade down to all of the member accounts and OUs within the hierarchy. And this gives you the ability to say, we as a security team don't use DynamoDB. We don't do it. For whatever reason, our auditors say we don't, we've decided not to, whatever reason we don't. At the organizational root level, you can put a deny policy on the DynamoDB service. And even if I'm the account administrator within a member account and I try to spin up DynamoDB, I should have those permissions, right? I have unlimited access to any resource in my account. But because my member account is a member of this organizational hierarchy, I will be denied, right? AWS is always looking for a way to deny your permissions. If there is a deny statement on that hierarchy or on that union of all of the policies that you have, you're going to get denied. So account hierarchies are a great way, especially if you're running not a lab environment. This is really overkill for a lab environment, but if you are in charge of security for an AWS account in a business or an organization, this is a great way to give a lot of flexibility to your account members, administrators, while still having some security control over their various shenanigans. So I do work at New Relic, so I have to include the word observability in my talk. I apologize. We can talk about it more later, but it's there. And so observability is logging, right? So for folks who are in the Windows world or the Linux world, you want to know what those pesky users are up to in your systems. In the AWS world, you want to know what those pesky IAM principals are up to. And so CloudTrail is the logging system for what happens at the AWS control plane level. It is a bunch of JSON files that get stored in S3. It is free to use CloudTrail, but you are charged for the storage of the JSON objects in S3. So, like I mentioned before, clicks in AWS have a lot of, or can cost you money. And I did say turn on CloudTrail. Turning on CloudTrail is great. If you're in a lab environment and you're generating, 100 API calls, storage in S3 is going to be probably less than $1 per month. But it gives you the ability to know what happened in your AWS account, which If you ever find yourself in a compromised scenario where a developer puts some credentials on GitHub, or you have an EC2 instance compromised, and someone's able to jump from the data plane into the control plane, you're going to want to know what happened, and CloudTrail is the way that you're going to know about it. The thing about CloudTrail is that it is just a log. It's a JSON file. And just like any logs, they're only as good as the things looking at them. So they're JSON files in an S3 bucket. You're guaranteed a lot of durability. You're guaranteed to be able to get them. But what are you going to do with them is the question. So some people will forward them into Splunk, or any sort of other logging aggregator. Depending on your environment is how many CloudTrail logs you're going to have. And if you're in charge of budgeting, this is sort of where in the cloud world you have to become friends with your accountants. Because if you have a giant account hierarchy that's generating gigabytes and gigabytes of logs a day or a month, and you only have a gigabyte of transfer into Splunk every month for your entire company, you're going to have browned out and no one's going to be able to use Splunk. So there are free things like Elk, Elasticsearch, Kibana, and Logstash that you can use. There are a number of cloud service posture monitors, CSPMs, which will analyze your logs for you, look for detections. If you're using, the Snowflake SIEM or any other sort of SIEM, you can pull these logs in. They are JSON files in an S3 bucket. I am not an SRE or a DevOps person, but once you have JSON files in an S3 bucket, you can go to all sorts of places. But your logs are only as good as what you do with them. I'm going to mention the first-party GuardDuty service. Like I mentioned, there are a number of options out there. Obviously, GuardDuty is a first-party AWS service, so it's going to be the most tightly integrated with Amazon itself, which is good and bad. If you're only in an AWS shop, that's great. But if you're in an environment where you've got a Microsoft E5 license for your Microsoft Teams deployment, you might randomly have a team running in Azure somewhere. And you might have acquired a company that runs in GCP, and then you've got your production Amazon stack. In that case, GuardDuty is only going to be looking at the Amazon logs because it's an Amazon first-party product. There is a small monthly fee for using GuardDuty, and you are charged for its access to your logs. So within AWS, there's data transfer pricing, and so the larger number of logs you have, the larger your deployment, the more expensive your GuardDuty bill is going to be. If you're purely an AWS shop, GuardDuty is a great way to get started on what the heck is happening with my account hierarchy. And it also will send you some alerts. So GuardDuty generates finding types, and there are 4 here. IAM, Identity and Access Management, S3, EC2, and they recently launched some Kubernetes things, which is more on the data plane side. Because it's a first-party product, Amazon is aware of the threats that are out there versus what actors are trying to do with AWS accounts. And I want to save a bunch of time for questions, but we can talk about specific GuardDuty findings later. They will alert you, but again, if you haven't updated your contact information, they're not going to find you. And so if you do have a SIEM, or if you have a shared mailbox that your security team monitors, you can keep an eye on for an alert from GuardDuty, but you still need to roll some incident response once one shows up. So I've been talking for 30 minutes, and where has it gotten to us? Because the smart people in this audience are going to say, we haven't actually done any work in AWS yet. We've just been doing a bunch of setup work. And that's true. We haven't actually done anything in AWS. And sometimes being a security engineer is building that foundation to enable your developers and your internal customers to actually roll with things. So working through this part of setting up an AWS account for production, we've talked about the control plane and the data plane. We've pretty much exclusively talked about the control plane. We have not talked about hardening instances, S3 bucket security. We've just talked about the account itself. So remember the shared responsibility model. Running in the cloud does not secure the stuff running in the cloud. Security in the cloud is your responsibility. Also, don't forget the financial plane. If you're a student or just getting started with AWS and you have a large bill, take a moment to breathe. Don't do anything crazy. Listen to the podcast episode that I linked to at the beginning of this talk. Get in contact with Amazon. They should be able to help you out. But don't forget the financial plane. I tried to mention it where services cost money throughout, and keep that in mind. You've all kept your root username and password put away, right? Thank you. Okay, good. We're not going to use the root user. If there's one thing that you can take away from this talk, if you are a security person in an organization and they use AWS and you are not sure of the answer of, is the MFA for the root user in a safe that I know about, don't go in tomorrow because it's a weekend and you'll miss the rest of the conference day. But Monday morning, look at the IAM credential usage report, see if anyone is using the root user, and if they are, declare a proactive incident. You're going to be much happier doing that now than once it's out the door. We've talked about account hierarchy. Again, there's a lot of complexity there that is not worth it in a lab environment, but if you are in charge of a production setup, it's going to be super helpful, right? You're going to be able, instead of having to go through some complicated IT procurement and make sure that the IAM rules aren't too broad and adding a lot of friction, you can just say, here you go, new software development team, here's an AWS account that you have full control over, asterisk, it's got a bunch of security controls on it, don't worry about those. But it really unlocks your internal customers to use the flexibility of an AWS account to get going. We've talked about observability with CloudTrail, New Relic. I did use the word observability twice. Let it be known for the record. CloudTrail is how you're going to know what people are doing in your Amazon account, and if you ever have to roll incident response, it's going to be your social logging. We've talked a little bit about detection with guard duty. If there aren't a ton of questions, I'll go into some details on those. But I want to make sure that we have time for questions because this was sort of a quick higher level talk. My contact information is on here. I'll be around for the rest of the day. Z1G1 is me on Twitter. My sister's name is Zoe Glick, and so we shared the Z2G2 at AOL.com account, and she had friends to email, and I would read her email, so I was given my own account, which is Z1G1, which is where that name come from, and your handle sticks with you from AOL to the present day. I also, if you're here and you're not a member of the InfoSec 716 Discord, it's a great place. It's where we do our monthly sync ups, so you don't just hang out with us just once a year. You can hang out once a month. And sometimes we have tacos in the park, even though I'll miss that one, I'm sorry. There's also the Western New York Startup Community Slack. If you're a student and thinking, I don't want to be an employee, I want to be my own boss, God bless you, but there are great resources in the Western New York community. 43 North is a great one there. Startup Incubator is they are investing $1 million for a 5% equity stake in a bunch of companies starting up soon. And there are a ton of people in this Slack who are helping students and first-time entrepreneurs get started with founding a business and rolling with it. So not just security in there, but accounting, lawyers, finance, VC, all those sorts of things. There's also the Buffalo Dev Slack if you're more on the technology side and you just want to ask some Python questions. Feel free to hit me up afterwards on these. I can shoot you an invite. There's not a great way to just put a join this Slack link in some slides. And the last thing I want to say is I'm going to be around the rest of the day. I got my start in the InfoSec industry a long time ago now because somebody replied to a Reddit DM. I was in the RNetSec quarterly hiring thread. I was working IT at a school district, wanted to get into security, didn't quite know how to do it, and I sent a DM to somebody on Reddit. And that person was a manager for the SOC at Dell in Rhode Island, and that got me my first job in the security industry. And so I want to make sure that I'm passing that down to the next generation. So if you've got questions about how do I break into the security industry or how do I transfer or whatever, please feel free to hit me up. The mask is on, but that doesn't mean don't come and say hi. I'd be remiss to say New Relic is hiring. We've got a number of security roles. I can talk about those as well. And I want to open it up for questions. And I'm totally going to remember to repeat the question over the microphone. I'm going to remember, I swear. Yes, in the gray shirt.
The guard duty, does that actually also analyze like web application firewall data? Like, would be able to trigger on like non-malicious IPs and that level, or is it just the log?
Yeah, so the question was, can Amazon Guard Duty look at web application firewalls logs? And does it trigger on malicious IPs? It's a two-part answer. So on the malicious IPs part, boom. So there are tens of finding types. I pulled 3 or 4 from each category. So the IM finding types and the EC2 finding types will alert on malicious IPs, either connecting to a known command and control channel in the case of EC2, or on the IM side if it sees, again, because it's an Amazon first-party product, their threat intel groups are looking for actors doing shenanigans in AWS, and they have their own lists to say, hey, this is going there. From a web application firewall perspective, not so much. It really is, if it's interacting with a log that is a CloudTrail record, there's probably a guard duty finding for it or a way to alert on it. But if it's an application that you're running, the Kubernetes new finding type sort of throws a little bit of a monkey wrench in that, but guard duty is primarily for Amazon logs and those types of alerts. Yes?
Does it detect brute forcing attempts?
The question was, does it detect brute forcing attempts? So there are outbound brute forcing, meaning your EC2 instance is doing something odd, but because it's not it doesn't have logs for each individual node. There's no like someone's trying to brute force SSH into this system.
Yeah.
I believe there's an IM finding for increase like a spike in API call usage, and that could be an indicator of compromise, right? That someone has, has gotten control of the account, but it's probably I don't believe there's a detection for like password stuffing of an AWS account itself. Yes.
So, what tends to be the most popular motivations for the bad actors? So, is it installing Bitcoin miners? Is it to try to use that as a jump off to get access to on-prem resources?
Mm-hmm.
Or is it just exfiltrate data from S3 buckets?
Yeah, so the question was, what's the most popular thing for an attacker? Okay, so I want to pull up this community resources slide. The motivation is as wide as attackers are numerous. So you can, if you put don't do this, but if you put a set of AWS credentials into a repo on GitHub, somebody's going to be trying to mine cryptocurrency within minutes. Mining cryptocurrency, mining cryptocurrency in Amazon is not profitable if you're paying for it. If you're using someone else's computers, it's possible to be profitable. And so that's where some of that bill shock comes from, right? There are 20 plus AWS regions. Each one of those can run hundreds of GPU powered instances. You can rack up a $60,000 bill in minutes. And if you're not paying for those instances, you can maybe mine some fake internet money and exfil it out. If you do some Google searching, Amazon actually has what they call the quarantine user policy, which is if Amazon detects your credentials on GitHub, they will actually apply an IAM policy to the credentials for quarantine user to prevent the launch of crypto mining. There are this is not an official award, but there is the S3 Bucket Negligence Award, which the community grants to people that leave a bunch of data in S3. There are industrial espionage, data harvesting firms that love a good, S3 bucket full of, applications for credit cards. There are ways, I mentioned it briefly, that you can jump from the data plane and the control plane into on-prem resources. So AWS has a number of ways of extending your data center into AWS and vice versa. And so if you had a compromised set of AWS credentials, a hypothetical example, you could take a snapshot of a database that contains usernames and passwords, exfiltrate that snapshot to an account you control, run offline cracking, and then you come back into the account, you've got common usernames and passwords in that environment. So just like a data center, or there are ransomware operators, there are industrial espionage people, whenever you're building a security, you want to try to get rid of that, the lowest hanging branch first. That is the crypto people, the I want to send spam email people. You can knock those out with some, the stuff that's in the AWS well-architected framework. If you find yourself the target of a nation state actor, an intro talk at a BSides is not gonna, you probably need some specialized help. But there are a lot of actors out there. I pulled up this community, so this is a community resource slide. This is not a limited, this is not the limit of the community resources. This is just what fit on a slide. There are some incredible researchers out there, Wiz.io, Orca Security, the folks at Rhino Labs, the Talos group. They're doing research about what threat actors are doing in the community. Talos did great work on Team TNT, which was a threat actor who was compromising EC2 instances to harvest AWS credentials to mine Bitcoins. So if you want to read all about Team TNT, it's out there. There's a great newsletter called Last Week in AWS, which covers both the business and security side of AWS. TLDR Security is a great newsletter. They have a cloud section, but it's not exclusively cloud. And Seriously Risky Business is a newsletter that comes out once a week from the Risky Business podcast folks, and they cover trends in the industry. Cloud is just another, it's another computer in somebody else's data center, and you're going to have attackers going after it. Any other questions? We'll go there and then at the back, in the black hat.
So what do you recommend putting the credentials in like an app solution that frequently rotated, like 58 per use?
So the question was, where do I recommend putting the credentials? In a PAM solution, what's the password rotation policy? If it's a green field, there will be no credentials. So an IAM principal can be an IAM user, which is a long-term, this is the Zack user in AWS, which is a way a lot of people get started. If you have your preference, you want to move towards federating into an IAM role. So you can have a role of database administrators or a role of EC2 users. And you can integrate that role with whether it's your Office 365 directory, Okta, your on-premises Active Directory, however your users are already logging in. You can set up a single sign-on where they don't need a separate set of AWS credentials. If you do have to have credentials running around, you can implement both a rotation requirement and a complexity requirement inside of Amazon. I don't believe there's a way to check the have I been pwned list for common or reused credentials. So as with all security things, if you can, avoid credentials at all. If you can't, password manager is a great way to do it. I could given a whole other talk on getting your family on a password manager. It's not the best one out there. My family is on LastPass. I know that they got bought by LogMeIn and then spun out and then raised a bunch of VC money, and I just close my eyes because the family is using it. We're not moving. One follow-up and then we'll go to, yeah.
I recommend Bitwarden.
I love Bitwarden. I'm not retraining everyone in my family. I admit that there's better technology out there, but it is just, once you get your parents, your sister, the ability to share Disney Plus passwords is amazing with LastPass. Highly recommend it. For the white shirt in the back.
I actually had a question since you mentioned things like do you have recommendations for how to use security hub to kind of track and make sure your business is tracking those kinds of controls? I'm not sure if you have that.
So I think I heard the question of what about Security Hub? Yeah, so Security Hub is an Amazon product that will help you aggregate findings from a number of security places. So if you do have other cloud service posture managers and you want to pull them all together, there are some recommended similar to the well-architected framework that you can pull in. I haven't used Security Hub in production, so I'm not sure of its particular quirks, but it is a way to aggregate a bunch of different alerting sources together. And again, if you're in that greenfield setup and you're native in AWS, it's probably a good way to go in, but I haven't played with it personally myself. We got 5 minutes left, so we'll do 1 or 2 more questions, and then next speaker will come and set up. Yes, in the back.
Have you found any anomalies that surprised you?
So the question was, have I found any anomalies of when using CloudTrail? Yeah, I mean, your users are going to user. I mean, for lack of a better term, there are people doing things that you couldn't even imagine with computers, and that's the power of that organizational hierarchy, is you give them full control over the member account, but you can still say things like, you cannot have a public S3 bucket. And you can apply that control to root hierarchy, and even if someone's going to try and do it because they think they're administrator in their account, your controls are going to prevent them from doing it. So it's probably not the greatest term, but in the industry, you hear people say like there are a lot of foot guns in that product. As sort of shorthands of saying there are a lot of ways to shoot yourself in the foot using it. And an AWS account organization hierarchy is a good way to hide some of those foot guns from your users. Cool, it was a pleasure hanging out with everyone today. Thank you for your time. I'll be around the rest of today, and have a great rest of the BSides, everyone.